Tonight on Dr. Phil Primetime, Dr. Phil discusses questionable content in public schools, including censorship of books in your kids' libraries.
My next guest gained attention after a video went viral of her reading from an explicit book she discovered in her son's public school library.
After seeing a September 9th school board meeting in Texas on pornography in the schools, I decided to check the titles at my child's school. These books include pedophilia, sex between men and boys. One book describes a 4th grade boy performing oral sex on an adult male. This is not an oversight. Do not interrupt my time.
Everybody,
I will stand here until my time is restored. These books are in stock and available in the high school. Pornography is offensive to all Clerk. People. It is offensive to common decency.
Is our next speaker.
Well, Stacy says that there's an intentional push for this material in schools. What do you mean there's an intentional push, and what material are you talking about?
Well, I'm speaking specifically about pornographic materials, and let's define what pornographic means, and that would be a depiction of acts of sex. And what I read aloud are verbal descriptions of acts of sex and also illustrated descriptions of sexual acts. Now, there is a coordinated push because I noticed they've all come in the same time period, which started at around 2018 to 2020. And the purpose, I think, is definitely to desensitize our kids to these materials.
What are you saying should happen?
Well, they shouldn't be there, right? Because if we're following the law, if I can't sit down on a park bench next to a child and be like, hey, what do you think about this, little boy? Why could you have that same material in a public school library paid for by your tax dollars?
One in particular that you provided is a grown male with a young boy, and that's a crime.
Right.
That's criminal in all 50 states, but yet it's in a library and it's not being depicted as defining a crime.
Where's the librarian with this who is monitoring these?
They're offering help to get the book. I can walk in and they'll guide me right there, so they're there.
And that's actually what happened. They are the ones that are actually selecting these titles. So we have a lot of what it looks to me like activism going on by the librarians by bringing this kind of material into our school.
Well, are you wanting to ban these books or restrict these books? Do you agree that there are books that children would be too young to see certain sex acts depicted?
Our educators and librarians curate our libraries to put books in age-appropriate categories. So the idea that that would happen is definitely diminished. Some books are mirrors, some books are windows, and it's important for our kids not only to see their lives and their struggles reflected back at them, but for them to also look in somebody else's life and be empathetic towards their struggles as well. And if we totally restrict that from our kids, I don't think we're doing them any services.
And you can catch that brand new episode of Dr. Phil Primetime at the top of the hour, right after our newscast.
And we wanted to keep this conversation going about book bans in schools. It's a highly political one, and people on both sides of the aisle are passionate about the issue. Well, joining me now are the two moms that you just saw who are on opposing ends of the book censorship debate, Stacy Langton and Lindsay Durtschi, who both appeared, as you just saw, on Dr. Phil Primetime episode. Ladies, thank you for joining us here on the News on Merit. It's good to see you. Stacy, I'm going to start with you. You know, that clip that we showed that we'll play again tonight of you reading an excerpt from a sexually explicit book at your child's school during a school board meeting, it went viral. A lot of people have seen that. What motivated you? And really, you know, we saw the response in the room, but what was the response from parents who interacted with you after that?
Well, you know, it's funny, Lindsay, because you personally are part of the motivation that helped me get into that school board meeting and to go and look at my school library, because what alerted me to the situation was an episode of Sean Spicer's program on Newsmax, and you were the co-host. And you guys famously did a story on the mayor from, I forget which town it was in Ohio, and he walked into a city council meeting with some pornographic book from their high school, and he said, you know, all of you should be arrested, and he famously stormed out, and it had gone viral. And then the next day I saw another story, which was a mom in Texas who read aloud from the book Lawn Boy. And that was, you know, 2 in a row. I really thought, okay, something's going on here. And, you know, I said to my son, come bring me your computer, because they have school issued laptops. And we looked up the books and they were there, and I went and checked them out the next day. And I think the reaction from parents when I did it, you know, back in the fall of 2021 was one of shock, obviously, because nobody had any idea that this sort of thing was going on. And then secondly, it was thanking me for my courage for blowing the whistle on the problem and exposing it. And look what it did. I mean, I was the spark, and here we are now. We're having a conversation about it nationally 3 years later, and this is the main battlefield in the culture war. And real quick, what was your son's response to it? Well, I did not show him the pictures in genderqueer because obviously they're, you know, really pornographic. And at that time, he was younger than he is now. He graduated last year, but he did understand the nature of it and that it was somehow very explicit and very bad. But I wasn't. I like kept the, you know, the book out in the garage in my car and like hid it because I didn't want somebody. I have 6 kids and I have little ones. I didn't want someone stumbling across it accidentally. But I think he was very proud of his mom because he felt like I did something courageous. But I think he was probably a little bit embarrassed because, you know, it was high school and kids were coming up to him and going, "Isn't your last name Langton? And was that your mom?" And, you know, they thought it was cool, but he was like, "Oh God, you know, I'm still uncool mom." Right. So to any teenage kid. Right. You know, Lindsay, you're on the opposite side of this argument. You know, talk to us about how you believe that students should have access to diverse viewpoints, even if some books contain the same material that Stacy is saying that she saw. You still believe that any age group, is that correct, should be able to have access to these, even if they're in age-appropriate zones in the library. Every student should be able to have access to those.
I mean, there's always been mechanisms in place for parents to say that they don't want their child to read a book, but to tell me that my child also can't read a book, that's not really the way our democracy is aligned. So, I mean, and I don't really want to get off topic, but this isn't about protecting our children. If this was about protecting our children, we would be talking about banning guns and not banning books. At the end of the day, I trust our educators. I do trust our librarians. I'm sure some books and some material does fall through the cracks. I'm not denying that at all. But like I said, there have always been appropriate guidelines in place for parents to have parental rights and say on what their children can and cannot read. These are not books being used for a curriculum, at least not in my state. But books are a great way, especially in this case, for parents and children to facilitate that conversation, that difficult conversation between parents and kids. Because there are a lot of conversations that as my children get older, that I'm like, oh, how am I going to talk about that? And if they are curious, they are going to find a way to find out that information. It is better that they find it from a published book that took money to make than from the internet where anybody can just write anything. You know, Stacey, how do you feel about, because I know some people make the argument that it's like a movie that has restrictions on it, PG-13, R, and it lets parents know what is in there instead of just being in a school library and parents thinking it's okay. Yeah. And books should have something similar as well, at least where parents are warned about what they believe could be safe. You know, we don't just allow our 5-year-olds to watch R-rated movies. What do you think about that argument? That's right. Right. And so to Lindsay's point, first of all, I want to say what we're talking about here is a little bit different than sort of like an argument about ideas and exposing your child to ideas. What we're talking about here, let's be very, very clear, is X-rated pornographic sex acts described verbally or illustrated. And we have laws against that in this nation at the federal level. And the Justice Department's website, the statute as it is written, it specifically includes cartoon drawings of sex acts. Okay, so that's how specific the law is. Now, secondly, regarding labeling or, you know, somehow warning kids in this section of the library, well, there is no labeling for children. There is no labeling for books. And this is a problem because we have books
I'm sorry, we have labels on the music industry products, right? So Tipper Gore in the 80s very famously won that battle, and she did it without having to have it done at the legislative level. She got the music industry to agree to put parental advisory warning labels on their products. We have ratings on video games. We have ratings on movies. So why not on books? And that is something that I have been advocating for since I spoke at CPAC in 2022 with Candace Owens. What I talked about is, it's my idea. It's called paw prints, and it's not a rating system. You don't need to say, hey, this sex act is more graphic than that sex act. You don't need to parse it out. All you need to do is a simple warning label like what Tipper did in the 80s, and it's called paw prints, which stands for parental advisory warning. And it would just be a label to say, hey, there's something in here that is X-rated and it's not appropriate for anyone under the age of 18. But until we have that, you're breaking the law if you're keeping the books in the library at school. You're breaking the law.
Lyndsay, how do you feel about that? Because I know, back to this movie, analogy, a lot of parents like that because they can tell their kids, okay, you can't watch an R-rated movie, but you can watch it with me so we can talk through it. And at least giving some kind of warning to a parent to have those conversations. Would you be comfortable with at least librarians putting labels on some of these books?
I mean, I think librarians do put labels on books. I'm not here to say that one librarian does something better than another librarian, but pornography is not just the depiction of a sexual act. Pornography is the depiction of a sexual act or, obscenity that is meant to cause arousal. So you can have a book that has, say there is, sexual misconduct or assault. That is not considered pornography unless you are turned on by that.
Well,
so
but you could print a line. People can be turned on by different things. You know what I mean? So who draws that line?
Absolutely. And then that's another conversation altogether.
May I interject?
Go ahead, Stacey.
May I interject here? I think it's important to remember the Supreme Court ruling, which I believe was in 1954, and Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart famously said on this particular ruling, how do you define pornography? And he said, well, I know it when I see it. And that was part of his decision. And this is true for all adults, right? All of us as grownups can look at an image and you know it when you see it, okay? And so it's not about whether or not the image is titillating or whether it's meant to be titillating. If it is pornography,
that is the definition of pornography,
you can't
Stacey.
show it to
That is the definition
Lyndsay,
of pornography.
let me ask you this, and then I'm out of time. Lyndsay, is there anything you're uncomfortable with being in a student's library? Lyndsay, is there anything you're uncomfortable with being in a school library?
Absolutely. If something is not appropriate to be in the library, I expect our librarians to take it out of the library.
But you trust the librarian.
Point of a library,
what is inappropriate to you?
What is inappropriate to me? I mean, if there is sexual depiction in a comic book that my 8-year-old might get to, absolutely. I'm not a Martian. Like, that is not appropriate. But the point of a library is to provide information, not to promote ideas. We talked a lot on the show about LGBTQ issues and trans issues, but I just want to know which book is going to influence anybody here to change their identity or to change their sexuality or to decide that all of a sudden they have, some strange, ideation that's not outside of the social norms.
Yeah. This is a great conversation that we could have all night. I'm out of time for us, lady, tonight, and I encourage everyone to tune into Dr. Phil tonight after our show at 8 p.m. Eastern. But I appreciate the conversation, ladies, and I think it's a conversation a lot of parents are having around the country. So, Lyndsay, Stacey, thank you for being on with us tonight.
This election could mean more than just a shift in leadership.